Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here in the cold and the rain. We're excited to have you all here. My name is Maria Salazar Ferro. I am the director of Newsroom Safety and Resilience at the New York Times. And I'm also the president of the ACOS Alliance, which stands for A Culture of Safety. I am really, really excited to be joined here by these three amazing editors. They each come from a very different newsroom. They come from a very different place, but they're all doing really incredible work to put the well-being of their journalists and the well-being of their newsrooms forward and doing incredible journalism with this in mind. So I'm going to introduce each of them, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit more about myself, and we'll jump right into it. I have, all the way at the end of the table, Puying Huang, who is the director of photography at the Texas Tribune in Austin. She works with a vast network of freelancers across the state of Texas on news assignments and for photo stories. She has overseen visual coverage of the Uvalde school shooting, the overturning of Roe v. Wade in the US, and the tension around the US-Mexico border. Before joining the Tribune, Puying photographed as a freelance journalist, and I just learned that she was in my native Colombia, so I'm very excited about that. Next to her is Carlos Fernando Chamorro, who is the founder and director of Confidencial, which is I don't think I need to tell everyone, but it's a Nicaraguan media outlet. Carlos founded Confidencial as well as other independent news programs, and he has worked for a variety of outlets in Nicaragua. He has also taught journalism, and he has been the recipient of multiple awards. Unfortunately, since 2021, Carlos has been working in exile from San Jose in Costa Rica. And next to me is Charlotte, I don't know how to pronounce her last name, actually, Ma. She's an investigative journalist and an OSINT expert. She currently serves as the social media editor for Bellingcat, where she oversees all investigations. Charlie has done extensive training for journalists on how to use open source tools to help spread and to help counter the spread of disinformation. So now we know who's here. I'm just going to talk 2 seconds about the work that I have been doing at the New York Times so that we also bring the perspective of a large media outlet into the conversation. I joined the Times about 2.5 years ago, and I'm running everything that has to do with safety for our domestic newsroom. The way we talk about safety in my team is we talk about it as a stool with 3 legs. The stool is meant to keep you safe and able to do your work. You don't have to think, ideally you're not thinking about your safety because you're steadily sitting on this stool. And the 3 legs are the traditional physical security leg, so your PPE, your helmets, meeting a source safely. Online security, because as journalists, we're all working online, so that's how you interact with social media, how you communicate with sources, how you protect your passwords. And the third one is psychological safety, and that's how we also give you PPE for stories that may be hard to cover, that may be hard to report on, or after your publishing could be hard. And I wanted to bring this up here because the way I'm thinking about safety is very much as the stool won't be safe if all 3 legs are not properly screwed in. So you can't do one type of safety without thinking about the other. And that's how we're working at the Times to put forward well-being of our journalists and well-being of our newsroom overall as we work through what has been actually a very taxing series of news events. With that, I have had some conversations with you all about this, but as my training is as a social anthropologist, and I wanted to think about how we build a culture of safety in our newsrooms and what that culture looks like, how we all share a view of the world around safety in journalism. And anthropologists often think of language as the way that we help shape the world that we're in. So I wanted to do a quick round robin from starting with you, Puying, about what language, what words you use to talk about well-being in your newsroom.
I think this concept is still a little bit new for the newsroom, but it starts with one person, right? For me, I use psychological well-being, psychological safety. I think I'm hearing the words trauma, mental health appear a lot more. And it's a start, to get people talking about this openly.
Carlos, how do you talk about well-being in your newsroom?
I think the meaning of well-being has changed through time. One thing was times of so-called normality, when newsroom is the target of harassment, of blockade to access to public information, even being spied. But you can work, and therefore, we talk about well-being focused mostly on economic compensation, legal support, these kind of things. When we went through a process of criminalization, when our newsroom was raided by the police, not once but twice, and that it became a crime in Nicaragua to be a journalist, well-being for us became equivalent of safety, of stability, resistance, resilience. But the key thing was safety. And the key word in order to attain that was trust, communication within our newsroom. The last decision to go to exile to a journalist is a very difficult decision. I went through that, through agony, several weeks before taking that decision. So, and nobody can impose you that decision. You have to reach the conclusion that you have to leave, otherwise you will be silenced or you will be imprisoned. So it's a voluntary process that needs support, that needs coaching, that needs persuasion, and everybody finally reached the moment to decide. And I'll talk about this because it has been not only a personal process, a personal decision, but it became a collective decision that everybody had to take in our newsroom.
Thank you so much. Charlie?
Sorry, Carlos. Yeah, because I'm from an open source research collective, I think we can sometimes confuse ourselves as being removed from the situation because we report on things remotely. We look at things from an online perspective, and we're not on the ground doing the reporting. So often when we're covering a conflict, we can trick ourselves to think that we aren't at risk, right? And that's not true. Safety in terms of psychological safety, in terms of well-being, is something that affects anyone working on these kinds of stories. And I think at Bellingcat, what we try to do is make sure that we don't talk about mental health in isolation and actually as part of a safety and security dialogue, because it is. You have to be safe in all aspects to be able to be a good journalist, to be able to do good work. And that's kind of how we work at Bellingcat.
Thank you. I actually, in conversations we've all had before and thinking about this panel, I love how, despite coming from very different backgrounds and different newsrooms, as I said when I opened, we have all come to a very similar conclusion that it has to be something that's shared and something that's very holistic. But before getting to some of these conclusions, there has to be an origin story. There has to be a place where we start. And I wanted to go to you, Puying, to talk about what, to me, and what I've heard from the work that you've been doing, was a bit of the origin story of the amazing work that you're doing, and it's how you all worked around covering the Uvalde shooting. And maybe you can just remind really quickly what the story was so that everyone gets on the same page.
Origin story. Well, almost 2 years ago exactly, May 24th, there was reports of a school shooting in the town of Uvalde, Texas. And I think like most newsrooms and journalists, what do? You run out the door, right? You head towards where the story is. And at the time, that felt very obvious, natural, the newsroom is going all in, but then you hear about what happened. 2 teachers died, 19 students, ages 9 to 11, shot in their elementary classroom. And you kind of realize that you send your people out into this atmosphere. Some of the reporters were at the center where parents were waiting to get news of their child. Photographers dealing with the media circus in town. And you get the sense that you're in this atmosphere that is, kind of, you're trying to do your job, but things are gonna get to you in the field. And that's really where it all started, right? I think from an editor's standpoint, you realize that it's part of your duty to actually have to make sure that people are well taken care of as they're trying to do their job, because that is what is going to enable them to do their jobs well.
Thank you. Charlie, I know that Bellingcat is actually is a big production. You guys work with a lot of people beyond those who are in your newsroom, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the general support network that you have in place, and how this support network spreads to also include those folks who are volunteers or freelancers who are not your staff.
Yeah, so even in our staff community, majority of our staff aren't from a journalism background, actually. A lot of our research lead, for example, is from engineering, which is really fascinating, actually, working in a newsroom or an organization, not-for-profit organization, that has so many different backgrounds and understandings of problem solving. It's very exciting, actually, to work in that kind of environment. But it means that many of the people that we work with, not only on staff, but also on our contributor side and volunteer contributor side, a lot of them are not used to kind of newsroom backing that you might get at a more mainstream media. I, for example, used to work at the BBC, and we had extensive training on how to kind of report issues or protect ourselves. At Bellingcat, a lot of the people we work with haven't ever encountered any of that, and it's really important that we give a very rounded and considered approach to that. So when we work on our work, a lot of the time we are looking into intense traumatic imagery and video. That's what we specialize in, to be honest. We cover conflict extensively from online open sources, and our staff and our volunteer community, which we have a designated volunteer community who people sign up, they're vetted to go into that volunteer community, and then we provide the staff members and that group access to trauma therapy, specialized therapists who are trained in dealing with PTSD, moral injury, those kinds of things that are likely to pop up in our work. And we also provide training and guides to the public and to our volunteer community and to any contributors that work with us on mental health safety and mental health hygiene. We have a fantastic public guide on our website, actually, into how to be an open source researcher, looking into these things but maintaining mental hygiene. And then lastly, we also build tools and encourage tools being made in our hackathons that make this kind of research more accessible without causing pain. So tools that, for example, blur part of your screen. So blur the absolute abhorrent image, but you can still see the details that you might need to locate where that image was taken, for example. And we also have tools that grayscale things as well, which also sometimes takes the pressure off. And it's those constant reminders of, if you're watching this video, maybe mute it so the sound isn't doing the impact. Perhaps take a break after you've seen this kind of imagery. These kinds of reminders are not just isolated to our staff and our newsroom. They're shared publicly in all of our communities, from our volunteer community, which is a closed community, to a wider public community as we work a lot in crowdsourcing and a lot of open source communication and training.
I love how you've just made this part of your journalism culture. It's not a standalone thing of think about your mental health and think about how you're doing your journalism, but this is just really handy tools for doing your work and taking care of yourself at the same time. However, it sounds like tools for doing your while you're doing your journalism, which is similar to the way that you were talking about it, Puying, you're creating tools for doing your journalism, but in Carlos, in your current experience, it seems like you're in a permanent crisis mode. You are all working in exile, and it's the act of the committing journalism is affecting you permanently, but not only the newsroom and the journalists and the folks working around the journalism, but it also affects your wider community, families, and just your network. And I wonder what you're doing to address the fact that this is ongoing, permanent.
Well, this has been a long process, a long crisis that actually started on April 2018. Now we are in April 2024. It's been 6 years. We had the privilege to cover a civic insurrection that exploded in Nicaragua. So for 100 days, we were telling a great story of hope. Then this story of hope became a story of terror, and we have to keep the voice on. So there is, number one, there is a sense of commitment as citizens, as journalists, on our profession, about not allowing a dictatorship to impose silence, not accepting censorship or self-censorship, and also to tell the truth. I remember very well the first days of this civic insurrection. Our obsession was to tell the names of the victims that were being killed by police and paramilitary, and that were completely erased from the first day by the government. So we built some kind of, let's say, informal network, alliance with the families of the victims, and there is a demand for justice. It's always present in the sort of kind of journalism that we're doing. But there have been a lot of tension and pressure. There were some young reporters that left our newsroom very early because they said, well, my family is putting a lot of pressure to me that I cannot stay in this newsroom because it's risky, because I'm going to be the subject of reprisals, etc. And yes, as I said before, all decisions are voluntary. You cannot impose on people one thing or the other. Everybody has the possibility of making its own decision. But I have to make a distinction between what I would call emergency and permanent exile. Emergency is this process in which you have to take decisions about safety, and that could be relocating people inside the country for some time, but sometimes helping people to leave the country through blind spots, or sometimes some people could do that through normal migration through the airport, but not many of them, but some people finally did that. This is a process in which I think it has a lot of support, a lot of solidarity from the audience, from readers, from international organizations. There is a whole network, I would say, that is willing to support this process. Now, when this, it could take more than 1 year, and we went out and we came back to Nicaragua, 3, 4, 5 of us. But then the second escalation of repression imposed a condition in which not only myself as the leader of the newsroom and the editor and others, but everybody had to leave, because otherwise we could not do journalism. And that takes a long time, and then people relocate either in Costa Rica, some people in the US, some people in different places. We learn to work remote thanks to COVID-19. 2020 was a great, well, it was a tragedy. It was a big battle against negationism of the pandemic in Nicaragua. We did great stories and journalism, and we learned how to work remote. And that helped us a lot now in exile, about how to communicate. Now, when exile becomes a permanent condition, it's a different story. It's a different story because it's not emergency anymore, and the process is extremely more complex from an economic point of view, from terms of sustainability of the media, from separation of families or reintegration in some cases. We had, for instance, a welfare program in Confidencial, or a well-being program at some point during the emergency period, but now that's gone, and we don't have a well-being program anymore. So the adaptation to the permanent condition of being in exile, it's a lot more complex. I will say, just to finish this, I think we've been successful in the basic point, which is that no one from our newsroom is in prison. One of our colleagues was detained in the second raid, and he was interrogated and taken to prison for about 9 hours. After that, a few months later, he died from natural reasons, and it was a tragedy. But we were successful in terms of protecting our journalists and our sources. This second thing has been extremely important, how to provide secure channels of communication to maintain this communication with sources who are also criminalized. Now, in terms of providing well-being in a much general term, I think we are far away from what we really want.
I am encouraged, though, to hear how much you're basing this in trust and community, and I think, to me, it sounds like a very good point to be starting, but we can come back to what's next for your newsroom. Puying, I wanted to, again, thinking about community and how you move forward, I wanted to ask you how you're building this culture, how you're passing on the thought of well-being, of psychological safety across the newsroom, which is a task that seems to have fallen on you as an editor.
I would say that I'm lucky to have other colleagues in the newsroom that also are thinking about safety as a priority. I think that's what it takes to nurture that culture. In the aftermath of the Uvalde shooting, it was so chaotic during the breaking news, but the great thing is that we learned a lot from it. And I was really encouraged by the newsroom actually taking steps to check in with the people that were in the field when they came back. We had a big retrospective. We asked what worked, what didn't work. And some of those things, about basic things like, hey, EAP, right? Employee assistance. Like if we're going to go all in.
Can you quickly explain what an EAP is? Because maybe not everyone knows.
As I understand it, it's an employee assistant program, which can help you get access to mental health services. But what we also found out was that it's often a barrier. Not everyone comes into mental health with a different awareness. Some people who know how to navigate that system will be able to go seek counseling, but others, as they are covering, traumatic news events, they may be more inclined to keep it to themselves, not know how to reach out. And so that got the newsroom to think about, what can we do about that? Can we remove some of these barriers? You know, again, kind of creating this culture where we're trying to take care of our employees. But yeah, you know, I think the way to kind of like to promote this culture, what we took from the retrospective was lessons that we were able to apply for our year-long coverage in the aftermath. And that's where I saw a lot of hope in being able to put forth some of those you know, things like hiring a psychotherapist, running trainings, you know, of how to handle sensitive materials, things about, you know, kind of what Charlotte was saying about, you know, if you're listening to audio, you know, how about you turn it off, you know, so you don't have to be confronted with, you know, the what can often be very traumatic sounds. But, you know, actually having someone come to the newsroom and have these sessions with the journalists so that they know what they're getting into. You know, often you do the work and sometimes you're having to try and figure out the emotions that come with it, but what if you had someone taking that initiative to give you that foresight, right? Kind of lay down the path of like, hey, this is what you might be seeing and this is how you can protect yourself. And then conversations, you know, before, during, and after, checking in on each other. I think at the Tribune we do a fairly good job at nurturing this atmosphere where we are talking to our colleagues, where we, you know, encourage one-on-one check-ins, you know, to make sure people are talking about it, you know, even being aware that there are things that could come up, because trauma often doesn't usually hit you at that moment. It usually surfaces much later. Yeah.
That can also have an impact on your journalism.
Right. I mean, I'm also, you know, another takeaway we had was the trainings that you do, it can't always be when there is a crisis. It has to be throughout the year. It has to be, you know, periodic, you know, sometimes doing the same training. And it's been encouraging to see the newsroom take those steps, you know, to have frequent sessions with the journalists and freelancers. Yeah.
Charlie, your newsroom's really diverse, or your organization, rather, is really diverse. And there are people who come from different backgrounds, different cultures. I also want to bring up different generations, which is something that's come up a lot throughout the festival. How do you create a shared language or a shared culture when there's so much diversity? And how do you make it flexible enough that it's accessible to everyone you're working with?
Yeah, I think firstly, I would say that any newsroom should be driving to be more diverse, us included. I don't think you can ever say your newsroom is diverse enough. And secondly, yes, we definitely have different generations. I mean, it's no secret if you look at my face, I'm quite a young editor. So yes, we have lots of different cultures and lots of different generations, but I also think it's really interesting. We had a kind of staff retreat last year where we were thinking about kind of a strategy and how we are going to move forward as an organization. And our facilitator started the session by asking us to first stand in a group of where we were born and the community that raised us. And then secondly, stand in a group of the culture that shaped us, which I thought was quite interesting because a lot of people don't think about that second option. A lot of people, for example, if you're born in Venezuela, it doesn't, but you spend most of your professional life in Canada, that Canadian influence is going to have an impact with how you engage with the kind of work that you do as well. So I think it's important when you're thinking about lots of different cultures trying to engage with well-being, particularly as being understanding that different cultures and different generations will have a different acceptance of mental health in general as a concept, and also are differ in the way that they might approach well-being as well. So I think it's good to offer the resources, but not force the policy. As Carlos was saying, don't kind of try to make everyone fit into the same box, but put loads of resources out there and loads of training out there for people to access and engage with when they want to and when they can. And I think I'm going to be talking later in another panel about pre-bunking and the concept of kind of preparing yourself for disinformation strategies ahead of time before they appear. And I don't think a lot of newsrooms think about preparing yourself for mental health issues. For example, like Fu was saying, she was dealing with an ongoing situation in Uvalde. If you can kind of put those procedures in place way before the disaster hits, and you're kind of doing that well-being check-in constantly at the beginning, those kind of tragedies, when they do hit, aren't going to be as severe. I think understanding the cognitive signs of trauma as well is also something really important, especially if you have a diverse newsroom of people that perhaps even have come from newsrooms previously that haven't treated mental health in a good way. I know any journalist in this room has probably had experience of that, I included. But yeah, I think having that understanding and having training for your management and your senior and your editorial board particularly on picking up those warning signs of potential trauma kind of forming and why people aren't turning up for work, for example, and approaches towards that is a really key thing you could do as kind of a preparation technique. And I would shout out Hannah Storm from the Headlines Network provides excellent training on this. She did a talk on moral injury and PTSD earlier this week. And she's a fantastic, her particular network and the DART Center for Trauma as well are particularly good resources for training in that kind of space.
I actually love that you mentioned training of editors. I love that you're all editors here talking about this because I think I call it the special sauce. You really need to be training your editors as well as your reporters and photographers. Otherwise, you're not going to be having the same conversation. And I'll do a shout out for ACOS, which does amazing training of editors, holistic training of editors. Carlos, last word for you. What comes next? You are no longer in an emergency, but you are still continuously reporting under difficult circumstances. Nicaragua is not looking like it's going to get better soon. So what comes next? What do you need to continue to do your well-being program? What do you need to make your newsroom and your journalism better?
Well, I would say that our situation is not a particular situation of confidential. It's representative of the Nicaraguan media in exile, but probably the same about Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, Ukraine, and Myanmar, and many other places. And I would guess the best word to describe it will be uncertainty. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen next. We are working for the week, for today, for this year, 2024, but we don't have a budget for 2025, for 2026. We cannot think or plan in the long run. We work every day trying to keep our sources on and to protect them and to protect our journalists. But we are less competitive to keep our newsroom together, in the sense that for economic reasons, let's say our budget or our capacity to provide this some kind of an extra well-being for people, it's not competitive with other options. People leave and take other jobs or take other options to migrate to other countries. They don't go back to Nicaragua. Some people quit journalism, some people keep doing journalism or move to other options. So the main problem, I would say, is how to adapt to a condition of uncertainty and permanent exile. This thing could change from one day to another, but we don't know when this day will come. We know that the dictatorship in Nicaragua is very fragile. We're seeing today the news about Venezuela. It's incredible that the opposition in Venezuela, with many, many obstacles, ended up choosing a single candidate of the opposition has the support of 85% of the voters. So that could provide a change. Well, in Nicaragua, that was the case in 2021, but the government arrested all the presidential candidates. When we will have a next opportunity for a democratic transition? We don't know, but that could happen from one day to another because the dictatorship are supported with the minority of fanatics, with guns, with some economic power, but they don't have people's support. So the problem, I would say, is that we require, let's say, some kind of a new paradigm for exile journalism. And I'm not talking, again, only about Confidencial. I'm talking about media in many other places that require, at this moment, probably not legal defense, but some resources in order to deal with uncertainty and to provide some kind of an stability to our newsrooms. That requires, obviously, digital security. Well, internet provides secure channels of communication, safety, but also allowing journalists also to grow up in this process of uncertainty.
Okay, I'm conscious of time and I want to make sure you all get to ask questions, but I wanted to do our last round robin because this was how is well-being making better, or putting well-being forward, making better journalism. And ACOS has been working for a long time to find solution-oriented tools that will do this, that will make better journalism. There's so many notes that I took here of like the amazing things that you guys have been doing, but in super quickly, starting with you, Charlie, how has putting well-being forward, can you give us an example of how that's made your journalism better?
Yeah, I think it gives our newsroom more resources, to be honest. If we can make sure that our staff and our volunteers are supported, we can do large projects because everyone is feeling safe and prepared to work on large projects. So one of our largest is on civilian harm monitoring in Ukraine. We have a civilian harm map where we're noting civilian harm incidents, having the date, the location, and video and whatever material we can find on that particular incident and plotting it on a massive map over the course of the escalation in conflict there. That is predominantly plotted out by our volunteer community, and without the well-being and the mental health and the tools that we provide them, they would not be able to do that work safely because they're viewing highly traumatic imagery on a daily basis.
Thank you. Carlos. Beyond uncertainty.
Beyond.
How has all this, I mean, the amazing work you've been doing of creating a community, of supporting your community, despite the uncertainty, how has this made your journalism better?
I think there are some gratifying things about doing stories under this condition of adversity and providing people a service, number one, to overcome censorship, but number two, to read stories that are really encouraging and provide people hope. And the second thing is trying to build and strengthen a community with our readers, with our audiences, which are in Nicaragua, in the United States, in Spain, in Costa Rica, in Central America, in different places. We think now in a much more, let's say, broad sense about the feeling of who is our audience, how to build that community, and how to build an innovative relationship with the audiences.
Thank you. Puying.
You know, I mentioned that in the aftermath of covering the breaking news in Uvalde, we also did, you know, long-term investigation. We were able to receive a trove of files in the aftermath of the shooting, and it was too much for, you know, any one reporter to go through. And because we went in, I think, you know, a lot of the editors had the idea that we couldn't do this alone, and we also didn't want to put our journalists in a position where they were also reporting alone. And so we were able to partner with other organizations, Frontline, Washington Post, ProPublica, which really helped distribute the load and also create a sense of community, right? You know, we're all handling this together. We took a lot of the feedback from the breaking news coverage about, you know, having a psychotherapist on hand throughout the entire investigation, so that if anyone needed, they, you know, would be accessed. And we, you know, we don't do it for the awards, but we won, you know, state and national awards. I think it says something about, you know, when the journalists are well taken care of, then you are able to do this long term, which really matters in, you know, topics like this. And I'll end on, you know, a note, because I mentioned we were in conversation yesterday. When I took this job as the, you know, director of photography, as an editor, I thought my work would be mostly about photo editing. But what I have found was that it is much more about nurturing the people in your newsroom and being able to, you know, share resources, right? That I think is one of the biggest impact you can have for people in your newsroom.
Thank you. With that, anyone have any questions? Hand over here, very enthusiastic. Yeah, please just, if there's someone you want to direct a question to, please go ahead.
Yeah, is it on? Yes? Yes. It's a question for all of you, actually. I'm just looking for more advice. I'm recovering from PTSD due to a work safety incident. I have all kind of resources, and I find that there's a really fine line between, on the one hand, trying to break open the taboo and start a conversation and engage with younger colleagues who are accumulating trauma without even knowing it by, for instance, watching photos and videos. And on the other hand, being perceived in the long run as the personification of trauma. And that your colleagues in the newsroom, yeah, they kind of know what's going on in your head, in your body. It's also not a nice position to be in when you're recovering yourself. So I would like to do my bit for the community, but how to do that in an environment where everybody's always forward-looking, orientated, positive, and oh, let's not talk about the nasty stuff. How to do that without sacrificing your privacy and yeah, to load more burden onto your shoulders, because you are recovering after all. So I'd like to see if you've got any advices or tips.
Does anyone? I actually, before you go, Charlie, I just want to thank you for being outspoken, and I think that's one of the first building blocks that we need to create this culture in which we're talking about it. So thank you, Charlie.
Yes, thank you so much for being so honest about that. I will second that with just letting everybody in the room know that I have borderline personality disorder due to trauma. I don't talk about it at work. Maybe I should. But it... but I do, I empathize with you. I think it's really difficult, particularly in a newsroom, where people aren't starting those conversations for you, and you as the person with trauma have to instigate them. That's incredibly hard on you, and you want people to kind of lead the conversation so you can kind of add to and say, oh, actually, yes. And I think it's the editor's position to kind of lead that, and the management teams to lead that. It shouldn't be on the researchers or the reporters to kind of be that first voice. I think as editors, we need to be better at that. One thing that I think Bellingcat, for example, could be better at, and I'm sure anybody from Bellingcat in the room might agree with this, is that we need to be better at switching off. We work terrible hours sometimes because we feel like we want to change the world and we want to help with a conflict that's ongoing, for example, and we find it difficult to leave the laptop and things like that. And I'm trying in our newsroom to talk about that a little bit more so that it can encourage reporters, for example, to take a step back and go, okay, if my editor is stepping back, then I can step back too. And maybe we should have a rota for breaking news, for example, so one person isn't working for 2 weeks straight on an incredibly traumatic story. So I think those kinds of practices have to be driven by the editors. But I do think if you are someone who has lived experience of trauma, then it's particularly important not to put that pressure on yourself to be that person, because it can end up re-traumatizing you if you're the voice in the organization of that trauma. And I think people often kind of expect the person who's lived that to be the voice, because you can speak from experience, but actually it's people who potentially aren't suffering from it who could potentially put things into the newsroom that would help those who are. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Add to that. You know, this is why the culture has to be there. It can't be on any one person, right? I remember during Uvalde, I was fielding a lot of phone calls from, you know, photographers, even some reporters. And I was like, yes, share with me. And then it wasn't until long before I realized myself that I was holding on to a lot of everyone else's baggage while also trying to process my own. This is why the training, you know, year-long is important. This is why you have to have other people. This is why professional help is, you know, so necessary, because you have to be able to promote that culture, but also be able to redirect people to the right resources, people that can, you know, give people the help that they need, so it's not on any one single person.
I don't have a proper answer. This is a conversation I usually have with my wife very permanently. And what we provide in our newsroom is basically communication, but we're not professionals. We do require also that kind of assistance, but as I said before, it's a voluntary decision for each one to look for it.
Jamile, over here.
First, thank you all so much. It's just amazing to see editors putting the well-being of their staff first and sharing with us. I'm thinking about a time when our industry faces so much adversity, and it's not a given that a newsroom that is here today will be here tomorrow. So while you've all created these wonderful practices that are very contextualized to the experiences and the needs of your own newsroom, I'm wondering if you could each share with us one thing in terms of well-being that could translate if your newsroom ceased to exist tomorrow, but could still support journalist well-being. And I hope none of your newsrooms cease to exist. I love all of your journalism, but I'm just trying to think, how do we translate the particularities of the context of the work that we each do, which is so diverse, to a more global culture of safety and well-being that can be around at a time when individual newsrooms face uncertainty.
I can start. I think for me, you can't talk about psychological safety or well-being in a vacuum. I think if you leave with anything, is that it's part of safety. It's part of the necessary equipment that you need to do journalism right now.
Yeah, I can go. Well, we provide public guides on mental health and on reporting on issues like sexual assault responsibly, which I think helps educate reporters globally, which is hopefully helpful. And we also collaborate with a lot of smaller newsrooms or newsrooms in general in hostile places. And what we provide in those collaborations is the ability to cover stories like Carlos is in exile. For example, one of our good partners is Sarah Setenta in Colombia. And that we're often covering stories with them, looking into incidents of harm that involve the Colombian police and the military. So I think often as a newsroom, especially if you're collaborating as well, you can also provide that extra assistance and protection as a remote working organization for exile media as well. I think that's another thing that we help with in terms of mental health and resilience.
Sorry, I wouldn't identify a single point, because I believe this is a much more integral or holistic view of well-being, in which we cannot separate physical safety, digital safety, mental health, economic well-being, and that extra element of, I would say, commitment. I mean, what is the mission? Why are we doing all of this? Why can we take some kind of an extra pressure in order to keep a media outlet going, or as ourselves as individual reporters telling the truth?
What everyone else is saying here. One thing that is always on my mind is freelancers. You know, we talk a lot about newsrooms, and a lot of times that, you know, we're thinking about staff, but as most of y'all have probably experienced, you know, we use a lot of freelancers these days, and they are often some of the more vulnerable people in terms of physical, online, and digital and psychological safety. So, you know, if there's one thing that I want to keep on working on, it's, you know, how can we bring these resources to people who every day are also contributing to the journalism?
And with that, our time's up. But I will say ACOS has really good freelancer tools, so please check out ACOS. Thank you all.